Welcome back to Always Wandering Art. It's a short hike to this beautiful waterfall. Let's paint it. A simple, inexpensive watercolor pad will do. And we'll be using the colors you see here with a range of flat brushes and one rigger brush. Okay, just starting off the painting, not really worrying about any details. Just laying down an initial light wash of Hooker's Green and Raw Sienna. Here's a reference photo. You can see that the forest is a very bright color because the sun is shining from behind the trees. So in this initial wash, we're just going to try to keep things very light and adding a little bit of some darks here and there for contrast. Still not worrying about any details here, keeping things very loose, painting the background wet and wet. Here's a reference photo again. Our lightest areas are the forest and the waterfall, and the dark areas will be the rocks and the foreground. I'm just going through with the brush now with some clean water, trying to get rid of any hard edges. Okay, time to work on the rocky drop-off by applying an initial lighter wash first, then darkening the area later on. I'm using violet and ultramarine blue because this rocky drop-off is kind of in shadow in the photo. And because I didn't use any masking fluid, I'm just going through and depicting where the waterfall will be using negative painting technique, meaning I'm just painting darker colors around the lightest area that I want to leave white, which is where the waterfall will be. A little raw sienna and burnt sienna here for the water down below. If you'll notice, I'm kind of skipping around and painting the water here and there and not just all in one area, but that's because I want to leave space for where the rocks will go. At this stage in the painting, I still don't have any detail really. I'm still just laying out the painting. And for some interest, let's put a fallen tree down here in the foreground. The darkest part of the log will be the underside of the log, and the lighter area will be on top. I'm using very little water and just one edge of the flat brush to add this type of texture. Now beginning to add some rocks here in the foreground. And even if it's that way in the photo, we don't need to paint every single rock. We just want to create the essence of the photo and actually add an artistic element to it as well. Okay, now that we've got the painting generally laid out, we can start to add value. So we're adding darker color to bring out the lighter areas. As my mentor used to say, you can't have a light without having a dark. So the rocky drop-off where the waterfall will be almost all in shadow, but we still want to leave little areas of light here and there, as if the light filtering through the trees is hitting the rocks here and there. At this point, the painting is getting there, but it still looks a little too flat, so we're just going to have to keep adding darker values until it starts to look more three-dimensional. Once we add darker colors around the waterfall, it's really going to start to pop. By the way, I'm working with a mostly 1/4-inch flat brush. I probably could have gone a little bit bigger here, but it is helpful for the smaller areas. Starting to paint in the rocks here by painting the darker side of the rocks on the left. Adding darker colors in the foreground will really brighten up the background and push the viewer's eye to the lightest parts of the painting. Okay, now to further enhance this painting, we're going to add trees that are in the middle ground. If you notice from the reference photo, there are plenty of little trees in the middle ground there. But we don't have to paint each one because that would just be ludicrous. Still using a 1/4 inch flat brush if I can get away with keeping these trees fairly thin. But if I wanted to make these trees even thinner, I would switch to a rigger brush. So we've added trees, rocks, fallen trees, but there's still not enough contrast between the foreground and the background, or the darker areas and the lighter areas. So the last thing we need to do is just keep darkening the foreground, adding more values until we really get a good contrast going. Oh, I think we're finally getting somewhere. Still not dark enough though, so here we go. It's just one of those things about watercolor. The paint always dries lighter than when you first put it on. Just adding some texture now for the trees in the background. If something's really far off in the distance, it's usually best to just leave the initial wash there. But if something is between the middle ground and background, oftentimes it makes sense to add a little texture. To add texture, I bring in very little water using the side of the brush. Any good painting could use a few more saplings. Most things in the distance usually have a blue hue to them. So to paint trees in the distance, I generally use either a violet or ultramarine blue. And sometimes it's pretty cool to just have trees randomly coming into the painting from who knows where. Now finally, the waterfall still looks a little flat, so at this point I'm just going to use clean water and the flat brush to just buff out some areas to soften the hard edges to give the impression that water is spraying out. So really the idea is just to diffuse some of these areas to give the water a softer feel. Adding some color here to give the impression that the water is trickling over the rock. Now, I don't want to leave the waterfall completely white, so I'm going to add a tiny bit of blue or gray to give the water a more 3D realistic effect. And just some finishing touches here. If you made it this far through the video, I thank you very much, and I'll see you on the next one.